But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Tom Turner. He's the garden historian and landscape architect as well. And he's going to talk about Jellicoe. We've got the Jellicoe collection here. You're going to tell us a bit more. You've got the animal theme in with a serpent. So thank you. I think you need to explain that a bit more to those of us who are not so knowledgeable about Jellicoe. But it's the subconscious, serpents and postmodern landscape. But is it okay, Tom? Do you take over?
Good afternoon, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be in Reading, which of course had the first landscape architecture course in the UK. I think that Thomas Mawson, our first president, I think he lectured here, but he got Parkinson's disease, and Geoffrey Jellicoe took over from him, teaching landscape architecture in Reading from, I think, 1932 to 1939. He was a design tutor until he became the principal of the AA. My own tutor in landscape architecture, Frank Clark, also taught here. And I used to lecture very occasionally on the landscape management course and indeed examined a PhD student in garden history here. So pleasure to be in Reading, and I wish you could get your landscape architecture course back. I got the impression from Annabelle when she kindly invited me that only 20% of the audience would be landscape architects. I think it's more, but I've set myself to explain what landscape architecture is like. So those of you who've had long flights, perhaps from America, might like to catch up on some sleep while I get through the first business. Geoffrey Jellicoe's book has done more than anything to explain and define the scope of landscape architecture. And the blurb, which I don't know if he wrote, he could have done, or Susan could have written it, or the publisher could have written it, but it's extremely good that the world's moving into a phase where landscape design may well be recognised as the most comprehensive of the arts. Won't read any more. He takes landscape architecture a long way back, and I agree with him about that. So 4 quick introductions. Firstly, to Geoffrey Jellicoe. He was born in 1900, and I think he saw the significance of that he was looking back to the centuries before and looking forward to the centuries to come, a very significant moment in history. He thought as a boy and as a teenager that he was going to be sent to the trenches, as all of his elders were, and was only too happy when peace came suddenly in 1918, and he turned instead to study architecture at the Architectural Association. He got a scholarship from them and published a book on Italian gardens in 1925. He was present, I believe, in the tent at Chelsea when the Institute of Landscape Architects was formed. He was the active agent in forming the International Federation of Landscape Architects. Secondly, the profession of landscape architecture. It's dated normally, and if you do a Google search or look in the reference books, it's dated back to 1863, and Frederick Law Olmsted is very commonly described as the father of landscape architecture. I completely disagree. Yeah. What he is, of course, is the father of the use of the term landscape architect to describe the profession that's brought us together. And that's beyond a doubt that he did. He didn't invent the term, he did give it a slightly new use. But I prefer, and I believe Geoffrey would too, to trace the history of landscape, well, to identify the first landscape architects as Gilgamesh, who wrote 4,500 years ago, and it's the first book identified as such, and he describes in it how he composed, my word, the city of Uruk, bringing together the elements that make a city. The elements are, just as architects compose with roofs, walls, floors, windows and doors, landscape architects compose with the 5 elements of vegetation, building, paving, water and landform. And so that's the art of landscape architecture, and it goes back well beyond Gilgamesh. The history of the art, then, I think it's best traced back to ideas that come from long before that, but to the temples of the ancient world. I agree with Vincent Scully, who wrote a wonderful book on the earth, the temple and the gods, that it's very likely that temple sites were sacred long before temples were built on them, as with the Acropolis. And one of the very oldest constructed works to survive, which is Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, it's 12,000 years BC, it's dated to, and it's not a work of architecture because it's not inhabited, which is the agreed definition of a work of architecture. Nobody knows what it was for, but probably for burials or a temple. So the art of landscape architecture is older than the art of architecture, much older. Now, a word on Geoffrey Jellicoe as a designer, and I begin with an anecdote that I wrote a review of his book on it's Michael Spenn's book, sorry, not Geoffrey's book, on the complete landscape designs and gardens of Geoffrey Jellicoe, 1994. And I was a bit embarrassed in writing about him because I hadn't told him that I was going to do that, and I felt that I shouldn't really be classifying him, which I was, as where he stood in the history of art and of landscape art. And so I didn't tell him I didn't think he'd read building design either. But what I argued was, because he was 94, was that his work was postmodern rather than modern, and I'll come back to that. But I needn't have worried. The next morning, after its publication, a postcard arrived which I've mislaid, and it said, "Dear Tom, thanks for the write-up, all the best, Geoffrey." So I've taken that ever since, that he's in agreement with me that his work is better classified as postmodern than modern. He certainly wasn't a doctrinaire modernist, but this project, which is the Gough Cave in the Cheddar Gorge, he designed in 1934, and it appeared in 1930s books on modern architecture. It doesn't appear in the Guelph lectures on the work that he did as a landscape architect. And I interviewed him, I've got a record of that, in 1984, and asked him about when he became interested in modernism. And he said that the interest came from Freddie Gibbard and his work when Freddie Gibbard and Geoffrey were designing new towns in 1952, I think. He said he got it from Gibbard, who lived next door to Geoffrey in Grove Terrace, and that he saw that there was an energy in Freddie's work which wasn't in his own work. But if you look at this, he obviously had a great understanding of and enthusiasm for modernism at an earlier date. However, to me, I think it's a lovely design, and it's tragic what's happened to it. If you look at the photograph above, it's just a complete mess now. But the most interesting thing to me is the pool in the Cheddar Gorge cave. It had a glass bottom and a restaurant underneath, so that you could look up and see the fish and the reflections of the fish on the floor as the sun came through. And he saw this as an opportunity. I wonder if I wrote it down. An opportunity to reflect, with the caves being there, and prehistoric people were thought to live in caves, since we call them cavemen. He thought this would make you reflect on the evolution of animals and men from the miasmal mire. So it's not the pure abstract design that it looks, it's got something else to it as well, which I'll come back to. Now let's move on to serpents. I know of 3 designs. One of them I'd forgotten about, and Annabelle kindly reminded me. There may be more, and if anybody'd like to do a thesis on serpents, I'd be most interested in Jellicoe's work. I'd be most interested to contribute. The first serpent that he... I've put that slide in. I want to comment on that. And this is a page which I've substituted a colour illustration from The Landscape of Man. He had it in black and white. And what he says is, just in the text here, the first landscapes consciously conceived by man appear in the cave paintings of France and come and northern Spain, without a name on it, from 30,000 to 10,000 BC. And if you think about it, nobody knows why these paintings were done. They could be religious, they could have been instructional for learning about the hunt, but if one were to speculate on it, it seems to me that it's involved with an understanding of landscape, and they were hunter-gatherers, so no gardens, no architecture, nothing. But they needed to know an awful lot about the auroch, which are these great cow-like beasts, and horses, and deer. They needed to know when to catch them, how to catch them, where they ate, where were the best, and so it required an understanding of landscape and how it related, not just aesthetic, but how it related to food supplies, water, patterns through the year, if what one animal was an indicator species for another animal. And so the modern conception of landscape, which is geographical, must have been part of the intellectual possessions of primitive man. When I say the modern conception of landscape, I'm always conscious that the word landscape was coined in Germanic languages, in Anglo-Saxon, and it meant land and scape, and so abstract view of land, and abstract in the sense of non-concrete, not in the sense of aesthetically abstract. Much like our term region. It was an area of land. And then it dropped out of use, and it came back into English from Dutch, meaning as a painter's term. And it then took on an aesthetic connotation rather than a geographical connotation. And as you all know, the word landscape came to be attached to gardens. I see it as a Platonic ideal for garden designers to aim to, but set that to one side. It became associated with real places rather than with an aesthetic view of a space in the 18th century. And then, in the mid-19th century, the geographers,
Geoffrey Jellicoe landed another plum job, the design of a new town at Hemel Hempstead. His designs look a bit classical, even monumental. They were, he now says, too backward-looking. They failed to capture the pioneering spirit of the times. The Development Corporation wanted major alterations and changes. Although they used some of Jellicoe's ideas, his master plan was abandoned. But he did design some of the housing there.
I always worked very well with the corporation, despite the fact that they turned my plan down flat. That didn't stop them from getting me to do building work inside the thing, and of course the climax of it was the water gardens. Well, it was a public park. It separated the car parks from the shopping centre, and it was a very narrow strip, and one made it so that when you were inside that garden, you were not aware of either of these things on either side. The car park was completely hidden.
What Jellicoe has done is to go beyond a simple plan and collection of objects and to build into his schemes connections with mythology, the history of ideas, particular artists and architects. And at Hemel Hempstead, the plan is based on a serpent. Jellicoe says that this shouldn't be brought to the fore. Personally, I've always found it much more interesting knowing that there is a serpent hidden there.
Such an attraction that it drew the shopping from miles away. This was the pull of what landscape could do. It was one of the earliest of what I think the modern public park should be.
Hemel Hempstead shows how far the landscape profession has come since its tentative first steps in the 1920s. It is now taken for granted that not just parks and gardens, but the landscaping of roads, derelict ground, industry and housing are now all part of the job.
Jellicoe's third serpent. This was a proposal which he described as light-hearted for Hyde Park. And if you look in the top right-hand corner of the aerial photograph, you can see the excavation site for the underground garage at Hyde Park Corner. And he wrote what a pity it is, this beautiful London clay, to be transporting it to a dump at great cost in Heston when you could do something useful with it. And so he proposed, I've always got it in my head that what he proposed was an earthy companion for the serpentine. And I think that's what he should have written. But what he did write was an earth companion for the serpentine. But as well as being a favoured symbol, it was also an amphitheatre where people could have concerts. It was a sound barrier to keep the noise of Park Lane away from the park. And it was a protection for Speaker's Corner so that you could listen to the speeches. And it was a serpent, but still no explanation of his enthusiasm for serpents, which I move on to. Another anecdote. I mean, I think it was an instinctive response. Really, I think he liked serpents. I don't think there was any theoretical basis for it yet, although that's what I'm moving on to. Another anecdote. I remember taking a group of students to visit him in his flat in Highgate. Don't quite know the date, but he was working on the plans for the Moody Gardens at the time, and he unrolled them on the floor and said, "Look, I did doing this, and I'm working on that one." And then he paused and he said, "I've been working on this one last week." He said, and it drew inspiration from some of my own works of art, and he pointed to the collection of works on the wall around, and he said, can anyone guess which work of art inspired it? And I thought, well, certainly not me. But one of the students, Sophie, she said, I think it was that one. And he said yes, and there was such a sigh of relief from all of us for having got it right. But I think that gives an indication of how and why he was interested in relating works of art to works of landscape architecture. And he must obviously have seen sculptures when writing on Italian gardens, like the famous Laocoon in the Vatican Museum, which incorporate serpents and other mythical beasts. And so what I'm trying to put you is that up until 1962, I suppose, which is when Hemel Hempstead opened, his interest in serpents was visual and symbolic rather than theoretical. I think he was an instinctive artist, and that the rationalization came later. In fact, he quoted Walter Sickert, "Never believe what an artist says, only what he does," said Sickert before writing a book, according to Geoffrey. But he became involved from 1954 to 68 with the Royal Fine Art Commission, and even more significantly, from 1967 to 74, a trustee of the Tate Gallery. And I think in that period, he had a much deeper involvement with art and with theories of art and with approaches to art. This is a picture of him with Ben Nicholson, with whom he became friendly, and also he was friendly with Henry Moore as well. And one can find a symbolic approach in Henry Moore's work, much as Jellicoe had, but you can't find it in Ben Nicholson's work, which is a sort of Mondrian-like abstract modernism. So there's a real distinction to be drawn there between one approach which is cleanly abstract and another which has got something else in it. And I guess it was about this time that he came across the work of Carl Gustav Jung. It may even have been 1979. Oh, sorry. And here's a clip from...
And this you felt proved that there was an unconscious which was something more than personal.
Oh, well, it was not a proof to me, but it was a hint. And I took the hint.
Now, tell me, how did you first decide to start your work on the psychological types? Was that also as a result of some particular clinical experience?
Less so, it was a very personal reason. Namely, to do justice to the psychology of Freud, also to that of Adler, and to find my own bearings. That helped me to understand why Freud developed such a theory, or why Adler developed his theory, his power principle.
Have you concluded what psychological type you are yourself?
Naturally, I have devoted a great deal of attention to that.
Jung was inspired by Sigmund Freud and worked with him, but then split from him because Freud had the rather narrow view that the instincts that affect our behaviour are primarily sex and aggression, and that it's an individual thing rather than a collective thing. Jung is best known for his work on the collective subconscious as distinct from the individual subconscious, and what he believed is that, and I'm myself very persuaded by this, that just as a yucca moth is born knowing that on one day only in its life it must pollinate a yucca, and it knows which day, and it does it, and without it the yucca wouldn't flourish. And then, you know, the eels that travel around the world and the salmon that travel around the world, they're all born with knowledge. So are we, surely. We don't know what knowledge, and we don't know which aspects of our behaviour derive from what we've learned and our nurture, and we don't know what derives from our nature. But I'm personally much persuaded by Jung that we are born with a collective unconscious. Now, Freud's, another interesting idea of Freud's was that the way to discover what's in the subconscious is dreams. And I mean, I'm a little sympathetic to Herodotus, 500 BC, who wrote that most of his dreams were about recent incidents that recurred, and mine are too, but Freud and Jung thought you could access the subconscious through dreams, and that we could get at archetypes. And I was just discussing with David before we began J. Appleton's work on this, who believed that the savannah and the forest archetypes and the boundary between them was of particular importance to us. And Jellicoe had a theory, which I'm not going into today, about the various evolutionary steps in the history of design on the land could be correlated with our evolutionary history as a hunter, as a farmer, as a voyager. I forget the list. He called them transparencies. So Jung believed that as well as these collective ideas, that there were also symbols that represented them. And I think Jung died in the 1960s. In 2010, so Geoffrey can't have known about it, Jung's Red Book was published. The family had kept it in an archive, and it was a large collection of paintings, sophisticated paintings with a strong symbolic content by Jung. And so Jellicoe can't have known about that, which would have explained a lot, because he kept it secret. I think he kind of thought that he was a psychiatrist, and psychiatrists shouldn't be artists, because artists aren't scientists, perhaps. But you see, there's a serpent with a tree growing from it. And it was one of the most significant symbols for Jung. The other painting here is by Paul Klee, who Geoffrey referred to, and he said that he probably has more to teach us than any other artist. And Klee had a diagrammatic approach to symbols as well, and there's one with a serpent. Now, if we go on to Hemel Hempstead, get rid of that. This is a most excellent park notice board that's been put up since the water gardens were restored. And it really does a super job of explaining graphically and with cartoon way. I don't know who was responsible, maybe it was Ollie Rock who inspired it. But there's rather a bad cartoon of Geoffrey there. But then you see a clay painting and the serpent, a drawing of it, shown on the sign. And so I think that by this time, Geoffrey has acquired an interest in symbols and also in Jung's explanation of why symbols are important. You might call it post-rationalization. I don't think it led to the design, or you might like to attribute it to a zeitgeist, because Klee and Jung weren't aware of each other's work, despite the similarity of their approach. And Geoffrey, when he did his serpents before the Hyde Park one, he probably wasn't aware of them either. And so there may be an element of post-rationalization, or it may be the zeitgeist that has possessed them all. So, to return to my postcard, thanks for the write-up, Tom. Geoffrey was keen on explaining, if you asked him about his design, that he was trained as a classicist. At school, he used to write letters to a friend in Latin, and they exchanged. And so he was interested in Latin literature. I think that's one aspect of what he meant by it. And then I think that he was interested in the architecture of the Edwardian architecture, 1900 to when Geoffrey went to the AA, which which was classical. It's called Ren-esque. It was a sort of a classical phase of the arts and crafts movement. And so that's another aspect of Geoffrey's classicism. And then, of course, his knowledge of Italian gardens. But when he writes about Italian gardens, it's rather significant that he doesn't go into the symbolism and the allegories and the mythology which current writers do. Instead, he's really looking at them as abstract designs. So, back to the words modern and postmodern. I've explained why Geoffrey's got claiming the reasons for using them both in relation to Geoffrey's work. But I really prefer the term abstract and post-abstract, because modernist, surely it's past its sell-by date. We can't continue calling the work of the 1930s and 40s modernist. It's preposterous. So what are we going to call it? And my own preferred choice is abstract. That seems to me the startling visual and conceptual characteristic of the art of the period. And thinking back to, firstly, to the 1925 book on Italian gardens, he starts off by saying that what a pity it was in the first paragraph that fancy and design have become separated. By fancy, he meant imagination. We've got a more specialised use for the term fancy, but Geoffrey meant imagination. And so he wanted, at the beginning, to combine imagination with the abstract aesthetic. And his book was 1925. There was a book published by Canon Iddings Bell in 1926. I'm sure Geoffrey didn't know about it, but that's the nearest ancestor of our use of the word postmodern. What Iddings Bell wrote about is that traditional Christianity is very important, but you can't sustain the mythological aspects of it because we've got science. We've got Ruskin's terrible hammers knocking away at the foundations of our faith with every new scientific discovery. And so he said what we need is a postmodern approach to religion which accepts the teachings and traditions of the church over thousands of years and yet takes account of science. And I think in that sense, postmodern is extremely appropriate classification for Jellicoe's work, right from the beginning until his contact with Jung and his use of serpents in landscape design. Now, I was lucky to be at the AA when they had a birthday party on the occasion, were you there, David, on the occasion of Geoffrey's 90th birthday?
I was, he gave a talk.
He gave a talk. And I wrote down one comment that he said, because he'd been the principal, and this was a long time later, "You may wonder what I've been doing since I resigned as principal of this school 50 years ago. I would like to tell you, I've been exploring the subconscious." A little bit of exaggeration about the 50 years. Well, no, I suppose, no, it's fair enough. He'd been doing it, and I fully accept that. He had been doing it, but he hadn't come across Jung and hadn't started talking about the subconscious as a contributor to his design approach. So, I myself believe that just as his history in the landscape of man is the correct perspective for a history of the landscape architecture profession, I also believe that his design approach, which I've somewhat outlined, has great relevance for us today. And I wonder a little bit if, at a subconscious level, I haven't drawn upon it myself. I say subconscious because I wasn't conscious of doing it, but when I look back at a project I've been working on these last few years, it does seem to be very Jellicoe in its approach. So let me move on to that project. Jung had a great interest in mandalas, and in his book, which he didn't illustrate, but he did contribute a chapter and put an enormous effort into it on man and his symbols. He explains the importance of symbols and archetypes and the collective subconscious in art and design and society. The cover has a very important place for the mandala. What the mandala shows is the world of nirvana in Buddhist theology. And so it shows the perfect world. And then outside the mandala is the world of samsara, which is the everyday world that we all live in. And the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, that suffering is intrinsic to life, that suffering is caused by desire, that the way to escape from suffering is to abandon desire, and the way to do this is the Noble Eightfold Path. It's an account of how to get from the world of samsara to the world of nirvana. And in 2012, just as I was retiring, I got an invitation to become involved with a school in the Himalayas. It's on the Tibetan border, and therefore on the Chinese border, and the country is full of soldiers because the Indians suspect the Chinese of taking it. But there was a proposal to design, it was an invitation, I haven't time to go the whole story, but there was an invitation to design a school which went to Jonathan Rose, then a young architect, and he had the idea, because Ladakhi culture, which is where it is Tibetan. Their language is essentially Tibetan. And he had the idea of doing something that I don't think's ever been done before, which was to base the school layout here on a mandala. And in 2010, I think, there was a great flood, and everything that they designed was washed away. The school buildings were up to this level in mud. And so all the little bits of planting they'd done got washed away. And he invited the University of Greenwich, and me in particular, to become involved with it. And so this bit was essentially done. And the landscape students, because I've mostly acted as a recruiting sergeant for the project, rather than doing an awful lot myself, did a plan for the grounds, which you see, and we've got two serpents. And where they came from, actually, was the symbol of the Drukpa order. Drukpa means dragon. And the idea was to make, well, that's what these red lines show, to make much more use of dragon symbols in the design. But the leader, the Gyalwang Drukpa, he said that it would be disrespectful to use them as paving paths, which I'd impiously considered. And so instead, they became shelter belts, and work is proceeding. So I finish with a little bit of video explaining the project.
We haven't got much time, but I wonder whether we could ask you a few questions. I'm actually quite amazed. In the last hour, we've gone from Hemel Hempstead to the Himalayas. I wasn't quite expecting such a stretch. And to see the serpent, I'm surprised we don't see serpents in every town in the country after. I'm sure we would have done if we'd have heard more from you. So has anyone got any questions they would like to ask Tom before we...
You're welcome. And while thinking, the silent video showing some of Susan Jellicoe's photographs of Hemel Hempstead, and then some of mine, the dates are on them, and then some of mine in 2009. And then there's probably still Susan's, looking far better than it ever looked before, as I photographed it this summer, and so we ran on to that.
And Susan's photographs are here in the archive as well, so that's really... And it's wonderful hearing about that anecdote about the Moody Gardens, because we were catching up with the cameras, so we were looking at those quite recently, weren't we? So to think that they were in these flats when he was working on them. So, if anyone has got questions.
Mark.
Tom, could you just clarify that the gardens were restored, did you say?
Hemel Hempstead?
Yes.
Yes. Several people, including me, ran a campaign against Dacorum District Council for having neglected them, and there were all sorts of exaggerated language used, especially by me. And the council capitulated, and they got a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund, and Landscape Design Associates, Ollie Rock, restored it. And he did a beautiful job, beautiful job. As I say, it's better now than when Susan and Geoffrey knew it, because it was a new project then. And yet they thought at the time that it was the project that gave them the most satisfaction of the ones that they'd worked on. Tim?
Yes, I also asked Geoffrey when he became a modernist, because I wasn't sort of convinced that he was a totally committed modernist. And he freely acknowledged that he wasn't. In fact, he was appointed to the AA not as, you know, at the cutting edge of architecture, but because he was a compromise candidate, and because there was a arts and crafts and there was a modernist, and he was the compromise. So I said, well, when did you really feel modernism? He said, well, there was a sculpture exhibition in Battersea Park in 1952. I think it's 1952. And he explained that he had a bit of an epiphany in going around and seeing all the sculpture. So he was quite late.
But what changed? Because as the Cheddar Gorge shows, I mean, if you look at the books published in the 30s of modernist architecture, to my mind, maybe it's kind of, to my mind, it's the best project.
Yeah.
And so
but there was a lot of architects who were designing in a style.
There were.
Without feeling it.
Yes. Well, I think that puts it very well. Yeah.
And on Hemel Hempstead, when did he actually say this is a serpent? Was that a post hoc rationalisation, or did he set out to create a serpent in the first place?
I think very good question. I can only guess. I think he set out to create a serpent. I think he remembered having done it at Morton and was making more of the same idea. That's my guess. But the text that describes it is mid-60s.
Just one more point. I liked your abstract versus... because there's always been this conflict between meaning in landscape and which gives these satisfactions, as against an abstract view, which is just the shapes and the colours and so forth. That gives you a sort of psychological impact. And obviously Jellicoe was very much in favour of meaning.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that it, this distinction between conscious and unconscious is actually the major thing for Jellicoe. He was desperate for landscape to have meaning. That's my reading of it. And I suspect that he wasn't, although he'd read Jung, obviously, because he quotes Man in His Symbols, I suspect that he was fairly cavalier in using Jung's ideas. Now, Jung distinguished between symbols and signs. Symbols are the things that come from our unconscious and are therefore inherited. They're part of our human inheritance from primeval times. Signs are cultural symbols, which we agree represent something. And I suspect that Geoffrey was actually into signs rather than symbols. Discuss.
Well, if you just give me a few years to think about it, I'll be only too pleased.
I wonder if we could just thank Tom. Do you mind staying behind in case anyone's got any further questions? I think that'd be really great. But I'd just like to take the opportunity from Mel and from the audience here to just give you